1965, Lee Kuan Yew wept on national television. He was mourning the death of his most fundamental belief.
You see, the whole of my adult life, I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories.
That Singapore could not survive alone, but it had just separated from Malaysia. Those tears didn't just show the vulnerability of a newly birthed nation. It created a lasting narrative that Singapore would survive against all odds, and within a single generation, Singapore went from third world to first. But here's the part that most people don't know. Lee Kuan Yew actually wanted to cut out that scene. He didn't think a leader should be seen losing control on the day his nation's existence was most in question. His instinct was to bury it. But it was P.S. Rahman, father of diplomat Bilahari Kausikan, who told him to keep it in. Rahman understood something few people put into words, that one of government's most powerful yet least understood capabilities is how it speaks to its people. This was the moment that told Singaporeans that this man deeply understood what we have lost. It was better to control the frame than to have it escape you. The visceralness of that scene is why it became so iconic, a defining moment in the budding nation's history. And you've seen them before, the kind that makes millions of people believe in something larger than themselves. It determines not just what people know, but what the government can actually do. It gave the founding leaders the space to ask the people to accept sweeping and painful changes. Just 3 years earlier, in 1962, John F. Kennedy stood before the American people and said,
"We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard."
A geopolitical contest was reframed as destiny. It tapped into America's deepest narrative, the frontier spirit, and the land where ordinary people could achieve the impossible. Within a decade, the United States was on the moon. JFK's speech reframed the difficulty itself as the reason to proceed. He gave the public a role to play, to be vested in a story about who they were. It was why the American people could absorb all the setbacks that came along the way. These were different moments, different continents, but it was the same force at work. Think about the last time a government didn't do something you thought it obviously should. Your instinct was probably whether the people in charge wanted it enough. You are attributing it to political will. But here's a useful accompanying question. What happens to them if they do? Would they lose the next election? Would it trigger a backlash that closes off 10 other things that they need to do? It becomes a question about policy space. What is permissible to the population? And what actually determines the latitude the government has, how the government speaks to its people. What it builds over time is a reservoir of public goodwill. It is what converts political will into policy space. Get it right, and you can take a country to the moon. Get it wrong, and even the most capable government starts losing the policy space it needs to govern until only a crisis can force action. Singapore is approaching that moment, and to understand why, we need to trace how policy space was built, where it was allowed to shrink, and what it would take to reopen it on the questions that are now unavoidable. Before we go further, welcome to What Makes a Country. I'm Kian Chong, your host, and on this channel, we uncover the hidden architecture behind successful countries, the policies, institutions, and decisions that create lasting, thriving societies. Let's start with how policy space was built. Here's a fact that most people don't know. Singapore's People's Action Party is the longest-serving post-independence ruling party in the world. That sounds like a tribute, but it's more of a warning. Because when you look at the global pattern, post-independence parties almost always lose power within a generation or two. Governing is not the same as winning an election, and the narrative that holds a movement together in the struggle phase almost never survives the transition to administration. Let's look at a controversial example. Let's say the Taliban. After decades of insurgency, they finally took Kabul, the rifles went down, the deaths came out, and within months, their own people were asking, what are we even doing this for? The thing that held them together, resistance, sacrifice, a clear enemy, a legible goal, expired the moment that they won. What replaced it was budget planning, permit applications, invisible, thankless work. A meaning vacuum opened up. You might think that this is a story that only happens to extremist movements, but it isn't. It's a story about every successful project, every company that loses its founding energy after it scales, every political party that wins power and has to forge meaning to maintain policy space. The PAP survived this transition when every other founding independence party had fallen. But how did it manage to do it? Every nation needs a story to make sense of itself. America, the frontier nation. China, standing tall after a century of humiliation. Singapore, an unlucky nation that survived against all odds. But unlike them, Singapore cannot rely on deep civilizational memory. It is more Venice than Rome, mercantile, brilliant, but contingent. For long stretches of history, it appeared as a footnote in the historical annals, only to be resurrected by the British as a free port. Rome could fall and rise again because it was seen as eternal. Its destiny felt preordained. Singapore has no such claim. Its existence has always depended on being useful to the world. Singapore has always needed to be narrated into existence. And this is the founding condition that explains why the way the government speaks to its people is existential for Singapore, in a way that it isn't for larger and older nations. For Singapore, the alternative is that it is subsumed by other people's stories, and a nation without a story has no meaningful policy space. In the founding decade, the survival narrative was imposed by circumstances. The fragility of the nation was lived. Unemployment at 14%, British withdrawal that eliminated thousands of jobs, deadly racial riots. The political will and policy space were present. When daily reality is precarious, you don't need a government to explain why they were making difficult decisions. You can feel why. Singapore managed its way through crisis after crisis and found its answer to keep policy space wide when existence was no longer in doubt. It simply delivered. Better job, better housing, rising wages, towards what Goh Chok Tong called a Swiss standard of living, a concrete benchmark that people could see themselves approaching. The results themselves were proof. If your life was tangibly better than 5 years ago, you know who to vote for. For decades, this worked extraordinarily well. This was sustainable as long as there were always countries ahead to follow. You could watch where they walked, avoid where they stumbled, import a policy, adapt it. Singapore's genius was in its execution. But the path is now gone. Which countries are so far ahead of Singapore today? The honest answer is that the leash is short and getting shorter. Singapore has reached the frontier. Not the frontier of Southeast Asia, but of governance itself. And at the very frontier, the pact between the government and its people fractures. There are no ready answers. You have to experiment. You have to try things that might not work. You have to treat failure not as evidence of incompetence, but as the necessary cause of trying. So as guarantee of delivery expires, the policy space shrinks, and this is the bind that we face today. But the way Singapore achieved its stunning track record could have widened the policy space for when the next difficult decision needs to be made. When there's policy space, you can see exactly what it makes possible. In March 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic, Singapore's government committed $15 billion to keep Singapore Airlines alive. It was one of the largest emergency interventions in Singapore's corporate history. The airline had grounded almost its entire fleet. Revenue had collapsed to near zero. The path to recovery was genuinely uncertain. But there was no controversy, no parliamentary uproar, and no public petition. The government moved decisively on an enormous bet, and the ground held. Why? Because Singapore Airlines is not just any airlines. Singaporeans feel the pride of having SIA consistently rank amongst the world's finest carriers. The Singapore Girl with the Kebaya as a representation of Singapore, the highest level of service and standard. Changi Airport boasted that. Families go there on weekends, couples go on dates. The airport entered people's emotional world because the interface was direct, repeated, and felt. And this is what a full reservoir of goodwill looks like. It is the buffer that allows the government to move decisively when the stakes are highest. When policy space is present, governments can make bold calls without controversy. When absent, even justified decisions face backlash. Now, ask a different question. What if that same intervention had gone to Temasek instead? Or to, say, SMRT? The reaction would be completely different. Because the policy space isn't there in the same way. And accumulating goodwill is a choice. One that Singapore has not always made. An understated example is water. Because here's where policy space was left to shrink. Kennedy named the difficulty before the attempt. So when America landed on the moon, the public didn't think, of course they managed it. They thought, we actually did the impossible thing that we said that we would do. Singapore did something similar. We named water as one of our greatest vulnerabilities. And because we spoke about it openly, it became a national narrative. That vulnerability drove investments into catchment and desalination. Singapore was amongst the earliest countries to pursue advanced water recycling seriously. Without a proven playbook or precedent, how do you make people drink their own recycled water? And decided, we'll figure it out. we'll run the experiments, we'll take the reputational risk. We'll persuade a nation to do what many others have outrightly refused. The whole project could have collapsed under the weight of public skepticism. So when Newater was finally announced after decades of work, it became a symbol for the nation. At the 2002 National Day Parade, 60,000 people raised Newater bottles to their lips and toasted the nation with recycled wastewater. It gave tangibility to the notion that Singapore could transcend its weakness by turning it into strength. This story, if told and retold to every generation, is what builds the goodwill reserve. It is what expands policy space. Singapore had the moment, but the story we told simply became one of water security, technology, and infrastructure. The story of Audacity was left untold. Ask the next generation what Newater truly means. You'll likely be left with a blank stare. Instead, success left unnarrated and unexplained starts to look inevitable. Clean water from the tap, of course, that's just Singapore. Policy space shrinks. And when it shrinks far enough, something breaks. Let me show you exactly what it looks like when political will exists, but policy space doesn't. It starts with a label. In 1997, Goh Chok Tong devoted nearly a third of his National Day rally to a new national priority. Singapore needed to gather the world's best people. The phrase he used to describe them would go on to define 2 decades of public debate: foreign talent. Here's the thing, that label was strategic. Most populations will slam the door on immigrants. Very few will slam it on talent. By calling the policy what it was calling for, exceptional people, carefully selected, the government made it harder to oppose. We weren't opening the floodgates, and you can't be against talent without sounding like you are against excellence. You cannot be against foreign talent without sounding parochial. The label created political cover that a blunter framing would never have achieved. The problem came about when the scale changed and the label didn't. At small volumes, the foreign talent label works. Nobody feels displaced. The hierarchy it implies by talent doesn't sting because the numbers don't make it felt. Between 2000 and 2010, Singapore's non-resident workforce grew from 615,000 to nearly 1.09 million. Nearly as many foreign workers arrived in that single decade as in the entire previous 2 decades combined. And between 2009 to 2011, around 30,000 new employment pass holders arrived each year, 2.5 times the size of Singapore's entire annual university graduating cohort. At that scale, the label that had been harmless at low volumes became something else entirely. Foreign talent. Imagine what that sounds like at 8 AM on a crowded MRT when you just read that another 1,000 employment passes were approved last week. What it sounds like when you apply for a job and you didn't even make the shortlist. The takeaway for the population was that you are not talented enough. We had to import the talent that you failed to provide. A label designed to make a selective policy palatable became the frame through which a massive demographic intervention was understood. And at that scale, the hierarchy implied was deeply felt by Singaporeans navigating a changed city, compounded by surging housing prices and MRT trains breaking down from years of deferred maintenance. So when the backlash came in 2011, it came as binary, local or foreign. For the first time in nearly 50 years, George Yew, a sitting cabinet minister, lost his seat. The PAP's vote share fell to 60.1%, its lowest since the nation was born. The election results didn't just reflect discontent, it structurally narrowed the policy space on immigration for years afterwards. The conversation Singapore needed most became radioactive. The political will was still there, the policy space was not. But here is what never became instinctive for most Singaporeans. The foreigners weren't replacing Singaporeans. Singaporeans had already started replacing themselves. In 2013, Kuan Yew said, "If I had to identify one issue that threatened Singapore's survival, it would be Singapore's fertility rate. I cannot solve the problem and I have given up. I have given up the job to another generation of leaders. Hopefully they, or their successors, will eventually find a way out." This is coming from the man who brought Singapore from third world to first in a single generation. Singapore's total fertility rate had been below replacement level since 1976. Not 2011, not recently, 1976. For half a century, Singaporeans have been having fewer children than required to sustain the population. And before you reach for the obvious explanation that this is simply what happens when a society becomes educated and prosperous, consider that fertility rates are falling in Nepal, in Myanmar, in places that don't fit that pattern at all. The honest answer is that nobody fully understands why, which means nobody has a guaranteed fix. So Singapore has tried what it can: baby bonuses, subsidized fertility treatments, extended parental leave, housing priority for young families. Some experts call it the most comprehensive pro-natalist toolkit in Asia, but the numbers keep falling. This is the context that foreign talent has buried. A demographic arithmetic problem 50 years in the making that has left the government with one remaining lever when everything else had failed: immigration. A shrinking workforce cannot wait for a fertility intervention that may take a generation to show up, if it even show results at all. The bills of an aging society come due regardless, and fewer workers means fewer people to pay them. But none of this was what people heard. What they heard was a label. And foreign talent doesn't say, we need more people because Singaporeans stop having children. It says, we chose these people over you. Singapore has always needed to hold both conversations at once: the fertility crisis it cannot solve, and the immigration it cannot avoid. But these two conversations have never been held together persistently enough, or in a way that made the public feel that they were participants in a shared problem rather than the recipients of a decision already made. And a conversation that people never felt part of only ever produces one response: local or foreign. Whose Singapore is this? And a government that needs to act, but with no space left to maneuver. So what will it take to reopen policy space on an issue like immigration? Think about why the SIA intervention worked. Because Singaporeans already felt SIA was collectively theirs, the pride of our airline. Families at Changi on a Sunday afternoon. Now, think about what the current citizenship process produces. A notification arrives, some paperwork, online modules, a ceremony when the oath is sworn, the anthem sung, and the pledge recited. Existing citizens feel nothing. They cannot feel that the new citizens truly belong because they were never part of the process. The decision was made and they are expected to accept the results. This is the opposite of how policy space is built. In his Musings collection, Kuan Yew proposed something worth sitting with: a citizen committee with ordinary Singaporeans appointed as one visible, accountable stage in deciding who joins the community. Feel what that would mean. Your neighbour, chosen by people just like you. Not a black box, not a bureaucratic approval. A committee that looked at who this person is, what they built here, and what they intend to contribute, and said yes. What that changes is not merely administrative. It is the very compact itself. The new citizen is not processed into a quota. They are received by a community that chooses them, and the community is no longer a passive observer of a government decision. They are part of it. The question stops becoming local or foreign. It becomes, does this person belong to what we are building together? This is communication baked into the policy itself, a process that makes the reasoning visible, the judgment participatory, and the outcome something a community can own and therefore defend. This is how policy space gets built. But rebuilding it on immigration is not the end of the problem. It's the beginning of a harder one. Singapore has already arrived at the frontier, and at the frontier, the question is not just whether there is enough policy space to act, it is whether there is enough to absorb any failure. Singapore is already making those bets, investing in AI before the returns are clear, studying nuclear energy before public consensus exists, establishing a national space agency before most Singaporeans understand why. These are the right moves. They are what governing at the frontier looks like. But the frontier is where things also go wrong. When an AI investment doesn't produce the returns projected, when a small modular reactor runs over budget, when the space agency produces nothing of immediate value for Singaporeans in its first 7 years, what will then the chorus say? There is no story that holds the failure right now. But it does not have to be this way. 2 days before the moon landing, Nixon's speechwriter prepared a speech that was never meant to be read. It was titled "In Event of Moon Disaster." It began, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. The plan, if the astronauts couldn't return, was for NASA to cut communication, for Nixon to call their widows, for a clergyman to perform last rites by telephone, and then for the whole world to be told, these men died in the service of something larger than themselves." The speech was never delivered, thankfully, but its existence is the point. America had built narrative infrastructure, not just for success, but for failure. Nixon was president when the astronauts landed. But the story that made the mission hold such resonance amongst the American public had been built 7 years earlier by JFK. His communication didn't just preserve policy space, it built a story that could outlast him. The bet could have gone wrong under a president Kennedy never knew. That story would still have held. Singapore has not built that story. No narrative that says, this is what trying looks like at the frontier. No compact that says, this is what we sign up for together. Without them, every failure narrows the policy space for the next bet, and the one after that. Building that space is the actual work of governance at the frontier, making the reasoning visible, inviting the public into genuine uncertainty, creating the rituals, the processes, the moments of honest deliberation that move people from observers to participants. This is how political will finds the policy space it needs to act. Singapore is, and has always been, a nation that was never meant to be. Its existence is not guaranteed by geography, or history, or ancient claims. Its destiny must always be narrated into existence. The fragility that brought tears to Lee Kuan Yew's eyes on that broadcast in 1965 is not our greatest vulnerability. It is our greatest discipline. It forces the question every nation that reaches this moment needs to ask. Not who will we follow, but who will we become? Because for a nation that was never meant to be, the most important story is always the next one. And it has always been written by a people who understood that the only thing more fragile than a small island is a nation that has forgotten why it needs to exist. Thank you for watching. I'm Kian Chong, and I'll see you in the next one.